Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Well, we've come to a point, Rachel and I, dealing with spiritual abuse, that we do want to make a bit of a shift, but again, want to say, as we address what's called for us to engage in order for there to be growing freedom, we do not want anyone to hear this is a matter of a few steps, doing a few things in a short period of time will create all the goodness that you want. There's a sense in which this harm is so deep, it lingers and will have to be addressed again and again and again. It's kind of like having, I don't really know the deep data about this, but somehow like the germs within us, we always have a cold, but somehow when something happens, we begin to feel the symptoms. Spiritual abuse is going to linger for a long, long season. But when certain triggers seem to happen, when there are words or persons or events that begin to occur, this is trauma. And like any trauma, it's going to have to be addressed progressively in the body, in the midst of your story, but with a larger perspective of eternity. But with all that said, where would you begin as to what needs to be addressed in order for change to occur?
This is a realm where I have to believe in the providence of God to provide windows and doors and cracks and fractures and things into these systems, whether it's a system that's covering individuals or a relationship and a bondage to an individual who's perpetrating spiritual abuse. But it's like that disruption that starts to let you know, maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe I'm actually in an insane world. And because the reality is, if it's possible, I think like one of the first steps has to be a movement out. But I say that as one who knows, like, I wanted out, and it took me about 3 years to start making that move, right? So I think naming that if it's not possible to just leave a community or to just break relationship, actually using wisdom to, in the same way, probably in many ways, how we would talk with someone who's in a domestic violence situation.
Absolutely. I'm so glad we brought that up. It really is a form, all domestic violence is a form of spiritual abuse. And in that sense, spiritual abuse always involves that kind of bondage that I've lured you into a relationship. You're now entangled with me. Right. And you've already spent so much time serving and gaining some of the benefits that the idea that you can just sort of like make a decision one day, I'm going to leave this abusive church. I'm going to leave this abusive boss. No, that's a nice fantasy and that's a nice 30 minutes Christian sitcom. It doesn't happen that way. So sometimes it's going to require plotting. And another word for that is praying. You're going to have to go through a long season to prepare yourself. If it's possible to get out, get out. But I think most of the time it's going to require biding your time, storing away, provisions, and to wait for the right season to leave. Now that can be used as an excuse to justify staying another week, month, year. But for the person who's actually naming along with us, this is an abusive, cultic, or narcissistic, spiritually abusive person, then you know that your first requirement is not to help them, not to change the system. Your first requirement is you need to get out. Yeah. And in that context, oh my goodness, you've got, and it's impossible to say a week, a month, a year, but you've got time to tend to the wounds. What do you see when you think about what you had to do through that process? And especially as a young woman having to do this, 19 and a half years of age.
Well, again, I think anytime, like, there just has to be so much kindness. And I think I could have used a little more kindness in the initial season of getting out, because what happened, I think in some ways, which is true, for a lot of us, in order to get out, I had to get angry. And so my initial out, it didn't feel good. And I didn't feel like a good person. I was angry, and I was needing the empowerment of anger to like give me that kind of burst of energy and cortisol to like make some movement. But I will tell you, I was angry at God. Like, if that wasn't from you, then how in the world did you let that happen? You know?
And what does it mean to trust you now?
Yeah. What does it mean to trust you? And can I ever trust myself again? Like, how did I not see this sooner? And, you know, I think I didn't have a language for trauma then, but I would see this man and I would turn and run and feel like I wanted to vomit. And my friends didn't understand, they just were like, Rachel, what is your deal? Like, this is kind of crazy. And, you know, I was in the middle of college, and in some ways, I would say that season that followed was like a baptism of the Spirit for me. Like, Jesus was very generous to me. It's almost like I felt like I had a season of respite, like I was in a cocoon of needing to be like resurrected. Like, just profound. I started reading like sacred romance and different books that were really just highlighting how deeply loved by God we are. Because I had been in such a context of like, you're a sinner. This is how you be good and righteous and pursue the truth. And it was very behavior modification. And I think to like actually just let myself soak in a different kind of ideology.
Boy, so much of what you just said, let me go back to say, you're never going to leave cleanly. Mm-hmm. There's no, like, submit your, your papers, have a 2-week working period,
Ugh.
and then
why?
And then have a party, celebrate. You're going on to other great things. That doesn't happen with cults and narcissistic leaders. You know, your departure is a violation of them, and they're going to make that very clear.
And it feels like a death.
So you had to be angry.
Yeah.
And I just want to underline, if you can leave and not be angry at God, then there's something actually disturbing about that. God will be able to bear your anger. And he invites you to bring that anger to him. All you have to do is read the Psalms of complaint. You know, Jeremiah in chapter 20, you're like a fire that burns in me. But what comes before? I have been deceived and you have deceived me. You have betrayed me. And so Jeremiah is addressing in Jeremiah 20, verse 7 and following, he's dealing with his own sense of God as a spiritual abuser. And so as we name this, you took responsibility for having angry.
Oh, yeah. And I had people say to me, okay, enough with the anger. Like, you've got an anger problem. You need to get your heart right. And if I could go back to that girl, I would just be angry on her behalf so that she could actually feel how profoundly heartbroken and terrified and traumatized she really was, But
even though we've spent a lot of time in other contexts talking about attachment, but those two key words, somebody who's attuned going, you have been robbed. And in some ways, you have been violated. And let's be more specific. You have been used to some degree sexually. You've been used to some degree physically. You've been used to some degree emotionally. Now, in that context, you have had the thief. The thief has stolen. Yeah. The thief has killed. The thief has marred. So in that John 10:10 passage that we often rightfully refer to as relating to the kingdom of darkness, the actual context is talking about leaders, earthly leaders who take their flocks and devour them. And that's always going to be the experience of being in a abusive relationship, is that you're being eaten, devoured, absorbed, used. And in that sense, of course, you feel complicit, you feel responsible, you feel at blame. So the process of restoration, did you have anyone in that time period naming and engaging these realities with you? The triggers, things that you were beginning to, you'd see him and then have to flee.
No, I had another pastor who actually I encountered through a friend. It was her youth pastor who actually did provide a lot of care and some healing categories in that season. But as far as no, and I think that it's really important to be able to name, I didn't have a sense of why I was so irritated and angry and defensive around narcissistic men, leaders. They would just be so, I would be in some ways almost like I would belittle them as an attempt to feel less threatened by them. I will never be so overpowered again. I will never be a prisoner again. I knew words that really bothered me, that people would use, that were trigger words for me that were used in that faith community. This is God's will for you. Or, I heard from God. God told me. And then, and I think that I would say for anyone who's really addressing these wounds, that's just really important work, is to begin to name and engage people and words and processes and rituals that trigger you, especially when so many of them might be similar in other contexts that actually are more healthy. But knowing that you could be in a healthier context and someone could use a word or could bring communion or anything that maybe was used to actually oppress and to violate could trigger, and if you can begin to know this is a trigger, how do you soothe in the midst of that? How do you know that you don't because I think that's the most devastating thing, is when you start to feel have all these things that could bring me life been lost for me forever. Will I ever get to be in a faith community again and trust that there could be goodness? Will I ever, for me, be able to be in a dating relationship again and actually not be afraid that I won't be able to get out? If you could start to tend and soothe in those places and offer care and safety, to know that you get to have safety, and it might take a while before you have safety, and you probably need to let other people know, hey, these are these things I'm working through. This is a part of my story.
Very few abusive worlds or individuals invite you to tend to your body with honor and goodness. Yeah. And so what you're describing is, how do we soothe when we're triggered in a way that honors the process? We can't stop the trigger. We can't talk our way out of it, but we can come to care for our breath, for being grounded in our body, and being able to honor and not blame our body or curse our body for what we're experiencing. And again, I just want to keep going back to, so you had somebody who at least knew enough. What do they provide? And again, I'm not blaming them for not being trauma aware or doing more, but what did they provide that gave you some sense of honor and allowed you to enter grief?
Oh, just they named that the context I was in, that they did name that it was abusive, and that wasn't God, and that what I was encountering was very much a false image of God, and that it was okay that it's going to take time for me to be able to hear from who God really is. And this is something I will say is a huge part of healing from this. Jesus always, always, always honored personhood and was about restoring personhood and dignity and autonomy so that love could be possible, because it's really hard to love from a place of demand. It's a completely different thing to love from a place of choice.
Let's just say it's not difficult. It's impossible. I can't put a gun to your head and say, tell me you love me, and have it be meaningful. And so that interplay of you got at least somebody who named you're in an abusive situation, and what you're experiencing to some degree is not what God wants.
Right.
That was enough to help you step out.
To step out and to also understand, of course, I've got some emotions about this. Of course, I've got some fragmentation about this. Of course, this is going to be a healing journey. and a process, and to have to keep stepping back into shame in the context of those stories. Because what do you do in a whole part of your life? You kind of want to split off. And I think that has still been my work. This is a part of my life that, even though there was so much goodness in the midst of it, that season of my life feels very dark when I think about my memories. And it's easy to kind of almost feel like, was that my life? Did I live that reality? And so I think to step back into some of the places where I still feel shame about that. I mean, addressing the draw to narcissists, which I will own comes from my own personal story and also comes from those spiritually abusive structures that still exist in our theologies. I think there are a lot of women who are drawn to narcissistic men because that's a lot of how Christianity socializes us to be aroused by.
Oh, it's huge what you're saying, and so in many ways. I've said in one book, we need to have an end of leaders who are narcissists. Mm-hmm. And yet, I don't think no matter who is speaking, but, on the left or the right, Republican or Democrat, I've never heard anyone differ about Trump being a narcissist. And so we like narcissists. We love narcissists. We feel a certain freedom to not have to bear our own freedom when we're in the presence of a narcissist who will tell us, we will be more successful. You will win to a point where you're exhausted with winning. Well, that sounds mighty good to me. You mean every time I pull the big switch, what am I? Gambling. What's the?
Oh, the little slot machine.
Slot machine. Every time you pull a slot machine, I'm gonna win.
Now you just push a button.
Yeah. Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Well, that gives you a clue how long ago I was in a casino. Well, that's disappointing. That's really a shock. Okay. Well, the point being
also, I do not condone gambling. I just have been known to play a few slots in my life.
Oh my gosh. Well, abusive leaders would not be well with us.
No.
The reality then is that in order for us to be able to name where we're being triggered, care for our body, disrupt contempt by allowing grief to be honored, it's going to require more. And that is, as we've talked about in so much of our training, you've got to step into the particularity of your story. Yeah. This is not material you resolve at 20,000 feet. No. The question of how would the abuser walk with you into a wedding? How would the abuser interact with you in certain settings in which he wanted you to be quiet, but also to let other people know, this is my woman? Those are dark moments, and they cannot be just swept aside with I was with an abuser who was narcissistic and who perpetrated spiritual abuse. No. It has to be entered in your story. Yeah. But I think your word of why are we drawn to narcissistic leaders is not to accuse us and to set us back into those patterns of shame, but just to ask a legitimate question that's part of the healing process. I think that sets us up to be able to say, there's not going to be all the healing that you want until you let yourself reinvent yourself in community.
Yes, this is key.
You will need eventually to put your little toe back into the body of Christ. Yeah. And yes, be suspicious, be cautious, be slow, but let your heart begin to experience what you knew to be some of the joy, some of the thrill of just coming to take communion, to hear a really good sermon, to let your heart sing along with countless other people. That's part of what evil wanted to ruin.
Absolutely.
And now is inviting you back into.
And I think that to me is just that was some of the sweetest parts of the season after, is just profound provision of people and spiritual formation, methodologies. And I started studying biblical studies, and it was stunning. And I fell in love with the text in a new way, with my own autonomy and empowerment and personhood intact. And a lot of dignifying communities that just loved they loved my strength. They loved this full person that I was. They didn't find it, they still found it a little bit threatening. I have to be honest. I don't know if I'm ever going to be like everyone's cup of tea. I don't know. I often say it to my mom, and we'll be joking about something like, when I pop off a comment and I'll say, well, God made me this way, so God had to know. But like every once in a while, I'm just going to be a lot. But, but I think that there's that sweetness of community, but also not confusing the grief and desire to still be connected as a weakness. Knowing it's not confusing that refusal to engage when you're not sure if it's safe as cowardice. It's really going back to that word honor. Honoring that this will be a process and you get to take your time, but you need to be moving and risking and like not letting evil steal your hope that there will be goodness for you in the land of the living.
There is delight, there is honor. And that's what the work of redemption brings us to. Not just eternity, not just our soul forgiven and given a place in eternity, that included, but to say that you as a person bear the remarkable glory of God. Now, find a community where when you plant your roots, because you're the one who plants them,
right?
When you plant your roots, this will be good soil for you to grow.
And again, I just, as we come to a close, like to name, no community is going to be without sin. That's why you have to tend to your triggers. Because if you need a community to be perfect in order for it to be safe, you will be set up to be alone forever. And so if you can tend to your triggers, if you can let yourself be held in community and to really know that things can be different, because what we know is true is we bear the image of God in our personhood, but we most reflect the image of God in relationship with others. And so that is God's hope for us. And there is nothing sweeter for me in all of the world when I get to encounter someone having access to themselves and access to God restored. It's so sweet and so powerful and so good. So it is my hope that this has been a conversation that gives people some places to stand and to ponder and some tools to begin to encounter the living God.
Well, I bless your tears, Rachel, then and now. And I bless the tears of those who hear this to be able to say, there's really hope. Rachel, we are going to tack on an additional. We said we would be done with a series on spiritual abuse, but we have had so much response and so many questions and frankly, so much kind appreciation for tackling this that we felt like there were a few things that we wanted to cover. So just to say, if you're tired of this category of spiritual abuse, we're going to do one more, and we promise that
that's it.
Will be at least it for a
now.
while. Exactly. So I would love just to begin by inviting you, Rachel, to go. What have you heard from people so far?
Yeah. In many ways, the reason we decided to spend time engaging this is because we had gotten so many requests from folks saying, I just need more categories of abuse of the spiritual kind. And usually from people who were engaging other aspects of abuse in their story, but saying, this is the one that is prohibiting me from really trusting that God wants to bring healing into my heart and prohibiting me from getting healing in these places that really I know I need God to bring healing. So I'm not surprised by the volume of the response, but it actually has kind of caught me off guard. When you initially said, hey, do you want to do a podcast with me on spiritual abuse? I thought, okay, we've done spiritual warfare. Now you want to do spiritual abuse. It just, these are categories that are not coming up in everyday conversations. And yet the response we've gotten has told me they probably should be.
Well, as I have gone back and probably will not divulge more than just 20, 30,000 foot as I say this, I have worked with a number of very thoroughgoing, profoundly
controlling narcissists. And as I actually, I don't know how odd this may sound, but as I listened to our podcast, I started addressing like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah. That was real. That I would have named it before as betrayal, that this person in this context betrayed me. Right. But when I started saying, yes, but they were a very significant spiritual presence in my life, and the things that they did in the context of the betrayal actually had a lot of God language. A lot of spirituality was blustered about. And as I'm looking at the maelstrom that I was in the middle of, I'm getting hit by certain limbs again and again and again. And it was, I mean, particularly when you began to describe some of the effects of being in that very heartbreaking dating, but also where the spiritual context actually set you up for harm. I began making associations. So I don't know if anybody who's been in the believing community in the context of service, where there really isn't, you're more than just kind of, you go to church.
Right.
But you have a deep commitment to the kingdom, you're serving, you're engaging. The prospect of likely being caught eventually in the trap of working with a narcissist, and if you are engaging a narcissist, the likelihood of spiritual abuse is, I'm not going to say it's 1-to-1, but I'm going to say the correlation is extremely high. It's important that we address what the effect is. And just, one word that we've come to is the word insidious.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think you said this even as we were just talking about, what do we want to talk about? That so much of the characteristics of a narcissist are really capturing, like they can so mirror a lot of the characteristics that we love about God. And I want to nuance that well, because they're using it to manipulate, and I do not believe God is.
Right.
But when someone has a big presence that feels like you can actually be small in the midst of it, or be as big as you want, and they will still somehow be big enough for you.
Can we just make sure that we say that again? In other words, you can be small and almost be like a child. This person will provide a kind of safety and structure that allows the small, young parts of us to feel like we can come to rest. Or when the shift occurs to wanting to be big, they're still big enough to be. That's so brilliant.
Yeah. Or they can read really well. They can offer something that feels a lot like care. That's not always where it stays, but there's certainly, a movement, especially when this is happening in a spiritual context. It's not like any of us find ourselves in the throes of a spiritually abusive narcissist because we are drawn to darkness. We're drawn to this appearance of light that is giving us life. And that is what feels so insidious, is that so much of the harm, when there's a realization of the harm, this person has so mirrored God-likeness that it actually has kind of, it just completely distorts and robs your capacity to then see, like, who is God?
Well, and you used such important language in one of our podcasts about having, in some ways, to give up faith to actually be able to come back to faith. And that, I had a number of people ask me about that. So I know what I thought you meant, and glad to walk with that. But if you'd love to go back to that.
Sure. I mean, I'm aware how tricky that language is. I also think we have so many categories of that in the text. Like in the biblical text, we have categories for people in the midst of profound suffering and betrayal who speak to God, if you are this, then I don't want, I look at Job. I think, like, Job straight up brings like a reverse creation poem.
Right, it's exactly that.
He's basically like, I wish creation had never happened. I wish I had been stillborn in my mother's womb. Like, if you created me and this is what you created me for, I don't want to have anything to do with this. So in many ways, I think what I was speaking to is because God had become so distorted in this spiritually abusive context, I know now that what I was rejecting was this false image of God, and really saying, I would rather try to go it alone and find something of life and air and breath than to be in this bondage. And that was a very scary thing for me because, again, I already named my calling felt very tied up in this. And it did feel like if you walk away from this community, then you are losing God. Now, what was amazing about that period, and this is my story, I know it's not everyone's story, and we're going to speak more to this because we do want to speak to those of you that in getting out, it's brought a kind of separation and division that has kept you out of community. So we want to speak to that. But for me, the minute I said, I reject this community, which felt like saying, I reject my faith and I reject God, it was as if, I was angry and I was mad and I was like, I will never trust God again. Jesus was so kind to me to usher in a season of just the kind of thinness and closeness. It was a season where like the grace of God was poured out upon mercy, grace, like a deep sense of like, I am loved by God. Before I am required to do anything or behave anyway or believe anything, like I am so deeply loved by God. So I think this has to do with my calling, but like I didn't have a long season of being like faithless. I still know I had to take that step to say, and to be able to look back and go, God is not bound to this one community.
Yes.
And so anytime our faith has the kind of rigid boundaries that say, if you take one step past this line, you will lose God. That's where I just go, that's not the character of God. Like, God is the one who says, like, I love Psalm 139 when the psalmist is saying, like, where can I go from your presence? Like, if I go into the darkness, you are there because even darkness is light to you. So that can, again, have been so distorted to haunt people. Like, I can't escape this God I've been given. But I hope there is just the freedom of the Spirit to hear, like, God meets us where we're at. So, like, the reality is we get to be a part of who God is because of the faith of Jesus, because of his faithfulness.
The insidious complexity requires a stance away enough to be able to see some of the beginning black and white.
Right.
You don't want to live with black and whites.
Right.
But to be able to say, this person set me up. This person used me.
Right.
This person created a kind of corral where I'm free to roam, but the moment I step over the line, there's a cruelty, a contempt, really a hatred that comes
humiliation
to bring you back in. When you begin to press against that, and you begin to then hear that you have lost your identity, you've lost your soul, you've lost place with God, you've lost community. Those are the points where we've got to address the issue of complicity, because that was the second issue that came up with some of the conversations. But you need to hear the narcissist spiritual abuser put a pretty good banquet before you.
Right.
And gave you things like attentiveness, care,
belonging.
Respect, belonging. And your heart needed that, and they read you well.
Also, can we say they also probably gave you, like, power and places to serve and to play and to bring your gifts, which is what we're made for.
It's what we're made for.
Yeah.
And that's why we're going to keep holding this word insidious as we talk about complicity. Where did you take in the food of a narcissist that then has created a kind of food poisoning,
Right.
where you're ultimately saying, I will never eat in this kind of restaurant again. I will never, ever have sushi again. So when you've literally vomited your guts out, there is a kind of repulsion to the very thing that you see having created this maelstrom within you. And I find, just as an example, many of our students here at the Seattle School have been in insidious
Yes.
and abusive environments
Harmful.
and come in very leery.
Yes.
Maybe having some place for God, but anything that sounds too religious, too constrictive, too orthodox, then it's held with a level of suspicion that requires really opening the door to what have you done with the heartache?
Yeah.
How have you turned it against yourself?
Right.
How have you turned it against, and again, I just want to put it in a broad sense, how have you turned it against God? How have you made him the abuser rather than the person who took on the personage of God and ended up spiritually harming you? And so that level of being able to go, this particular church, this particular person, yes, they attempted to represent God, and maybe they did in some wonderful ways, but in other ways, they used this corral to create a context to be able to brand me and bind me. And now that I'm beginning to move out of that, I have to name my movement out of the corral is really an invitation from God. Even in my doubt of him, even in my fury toward him, it's part of worship. So that if we can say that lament actually is a form of complaint, and that complaint requires us to take God on with all those core questions.
Exactly.
So that's what I've at least found is not permissible in settings that are really ruled by a narcissist, where you really can question, doubt, struggle, and make decisions that truly thwart what the larger group requires, yet you still get to be part. That is foreign. So all to say, this escape to cynicism, either you remain compliant, hate yourself, or you turn to cynicism, and in many ways, externalize your hurt through a form of other-centered contempt.
Right.
That feels like a very high risk for those coming out.
Yes, and that is a high risk. And again, it's where I go, I so understand why there is that need to defend yourself, to never be taken in like that, to never be fooled like that, to never be abused and held in bondage like that. That cynical move is a move of dismembering. It's a move of disembodiment. And so where the risk is you're no less bound to that abusive context or to that abuser when has to be that much defense in order to stay safe. There's a loss of freedom that is absolutely heartbreaking.
Well, dismembering versus remembering.
Right.
And as painful as it was for me, even listening to one of our podcasts, having it begin to play, Dan, did you not name that this was a spiritually abusive realm that you were in? And again, I don't claim to be one of the brightest bulbs nor one of the most wise, but it was shocking to come back to my own story and go, just naming this is spiritual abuse. And what it opened up was that very point. I will not be ever sucked into a powerful man's presence to let my heart be that susceptible to harm. And so, yes, there's grief. Yes, there's honor. But there also has to be something where we begin to break directly those vows that came, because evil would just as much prefer to, in many ways, gain access to our heart through our own disjunction and dismembering as to remain in that abusive
Well, and let's just be clear. Those vows are so connected to other-centered contempt and self-contempt, because to say, I will never be taken in by a narcissist, even if you can say, I will never be taken in by an abuser, and you're naming what is true, there's still an indictment on your own heart
Yes.
that you were complicit in something of that. And that's where I go, Jesus wants to bring freedom to these places where your heart has been named dark because of the harm you've experienced in that community, and wants to tend to the places where you actually do long for communion. You do long for care. You do long to have a place to bring your gifts and to participate in the kingdom of God that is unfolding all around us. And it just feels helpful to name, we're speaking somewhat abstractly, but even in this cultural moment, and I know we're coming close to the end of our time, but even in this cultural moment, we have students walking out of high schools today, many of whom have been raised in churches that are so fused with ideologies and theologies that have their own kind of spiritually abusive containment. Because when you say there's no room for disagreement, there's no room for a kind of questioning and critique of our own convictions, our own kind of, like, we need to be in communities that allow us to have our hearts come under that sense of, like, search our God, search our hearts, oh God. Like, search us and help us to see where we've given our hearts over to something that does not reflect your goodness. So we are in a cultural moment where in many ways the identity of the church in the United States of America, especially in certain communities, is having to reckon with spiritually abusive ideologies that are tied to narcissistic, abusive ideologies of our larger culture. And so it just has to be named. I think this is very pervasive right now. And it breaks my heart to think that people feel the only option is to leave God and to leave the faith, because the Spirit is birthing life in unexpected places. And we do get to be invited to play.
Whenever you put a person into a bind where if you do X, then Y will necessitate. If you bend a knee at a game before the national or during the national anthem, you are opposed to police and you are opposed to the military. That may be true with some, but bending a knee in and of itself does not prove one way or the other what your heart is toward the police or toward this country. So the moment we make assumptions, X means Y, and it's invariable. It's like, well, there are some who bend a knee for profit. There's some who don't bend a knee because they're afraid of losing profit. So to say, if you really love God, you will not bend a knee in a setting like a sports event. That's a form not only of spiritual abuse, but a form of colonialism that has a kind of narcissistic, dogmatic structure that once you give into, then apparently the only thing that other people can do is oppose it, versus being able to go, no, we get to ask questions. How is it that you have come to this conclusion that walking out of a school is a rebellious thing that cannot be supported if you really love God? Right. No, it is possible to walk out of school today and only do so because your peers are, which means it has no meaning to you. But on the other hand, it is very possible to walk out because you really do believe that as a young person susceptible to great harm, that you need to address decision-making in our country that feels contrary to what you know to be true of goodness. So all I'm hoping that people will hear is, let's define spiritual abuse well. It's where you are bound by a person with great power who necessitates a particular direction in order to keep relationship with them. Right. When that's the case, there's something inside that may gain, but you know the byproduct of standing apart is that you're going to experience loss. And for a lot of people, as we end today, you know that if you continue to move in a direction of hope, health, goodness, you're going to lose friends. Right. And you're going to lose communities because those communities require a level of extra biblical life that is not consistent with what it really means to love.
And they start to require a kind of blindness that when you start to see, you can't unsee. And I would say the same is on the other side of like being bound to hypervigilance and cynicism. It's a different kind of blindness that feels a lot like safety. But I do think Jesus is capable of bringing the kind of sight that we most long for.
I'll say to that, amen. Thank you.
I wanted to take a moment as we depart to tell you about a few opportunities that I really want to make sure you know about. So if you've been looking for more ways to get involved or interested in diving into some of your own story work, we wanted to let you know about some exciting new opportunities happening here at the Allender Center. I don't know if you've already heard, but we just launched a brand new online course called To Be Told with the one and only Dan Allender. It's the same content as our conference, but now available for you to watch at home at your own pace. If you've ever found yourself asking, where is God leading me? Or why do I keep repeating the same patterns and ending up in the same types of relationships? I cannot recommend this course enough. You will be invited to love boldly, make sense of your story, find healing, and make changes that last. Speaking of changes, we've had quite a few over the past few months, as many of you know, and one has been that many of our trainings and workshops for the year ahead are now being offered virtually. So if you've not been able to attend our certificate in narrative-focused trauma care level 1 because of travel requirements, this is a truly unique opportunity, which takes place over the course of 4 weekends throughout the year and offers training to therapists, pastors, ministry leaders, stay-at-home moms, engineers, and many other advocates committed to working on behalf of healing and redemption. You get to learn from members of our teaching staff, and you participate in a healing process yourself with a group of people under a seasoned facilitator. The certificate require applications, so check that out. You can find that on our website at theallendercenter.org, along with information about our new online course. The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.